Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Dominique, and many thanks to all the organizers of the seminar for making it possible for me to be here today. The paper that I'm presenting is basically a very short summary of the first year of my PhD, with the focus on the empirical work that I've done so far. So first, I'll introduce the controversy about the correct label for the Donbas conflict. Then I'll outline how a more transparent methodology can shed more light on this issue. After that, I'll turn to my proposed model of an escalation sequence for the Donbas. And finally, I'll briefly zoom into one illustrative case study. So here's the underlying puzzle. All the academic literature acknowledges that the outbreak of the Donbas conflict involved both local separatism and Russian interference. But what scholars very much disagree on is which one of these two factors was more important, which one was decisive. One side portrays the war as a local uprising in which Russia helped a little bit, and the other side argues that Russia was actually the key player. So the question we have here is this a civil war with some degree of outside interference, or an interstate war in the disguise of a domestic conflict? And this distinction has actually some important implications. And it is an issue of data quality, because it determines how the war is coded in data sets and then used for further research. It influences how scholars view Ukraine and Russia. And it also influences where scholars and politicians locate the keys to conflict resolution. Now we all know that the question of Russia's role in the conflict is surrounded by a lot of emotion and also disinformation. And this means it is crucial to have a transparent methodology. But unfortunately, this is a bit of a weak spot in the existing literature. Some authors do talk about process tracing as the methodology of choice in this context. But there's relatively little discussion about how this is actually done properly. Now, essentially, process tracing tries to open the black box between cause and effect. It tries to find the actors and actions that link the two. So good process tracing analysis has to be transparent about the evidence it uses and about why this evidence supports its hypothesis. But it also has to be transparent about why the evidence doesn't support alternatives to that hypothesis. Now, obviously, good process tracing analysis very much depends on good sources of evidence. And here I would like to introduce open source intelligence analysis. Now, this is a technique that tries to make use of the internet, of information from the internet in a more forensic way. At the moment, this is mainly used by journalists, like, for example, the Bellingcat group. But I would argue that it's actually an important tool for academic research as well. Now, there are two parts to open source intelligence analysis. There are some tools that help to find and verify things on the internet. But more important is actually its forensic focus. So the search for the primary sources behind any claim that is made, and the discussion about whether and why these sources should be trusted. And exactly this kind of source criticism is often neglected in the current literature. Now, how does this work in practice? First of all, to create an initial open source data set, I have used Python programming language to collect about 58,000 news reports. And these reports cover the formative phase of the conflict from different ideological angles. So Ukrainian, Russian, and separatist. Then, in a second step, I read through a sample of this data and did additional keyword searches to identify critical junctures in the escalation of the conflict. Now, these critical junctures are episodes which, on the one hand, increased the level of violence beyond the limits that previously defined the conflict. And on the other hand, they also left a lasting legacy of violence, either by causing large-scale destruction on their own or by leading to further conflict escalation. and argue that these critical junctures are the key components of the conflict that will need further scrutiny in terms of the role of local factors versus Russian intervention. Now, overall, I identified 6 critical junctures during the crucial time period between the ouster of Yanukovych and the first Minsk peace agreement. The first armed building occupations in Donetsk and Luhansk in early April, the appearance of armed militias and the outbreak of fighting around Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in mid to late April, the short-lived armed clashes in Mariupol, and the spread of fighting across large parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in late May, and the use of tanks and heavy artillery from mid-June onwards, and then Russia's more open intervention in late August. Now, one potential objection to this escalation sequence would be that it omits the pro-Russian demonstrations that took place in March. But I would argue that it is important not to assume that civil unrest automatically led to militarized conflict. And if we look a bit closer, there isn't really any convincing evidence that the demonstrations in March were actually necessary conditions for the further escalation of the conflict. What distinguished events in early April was that there was a relatively small group of people who occupied buildings, but then stayed in those buildings, built barricades around them, and obtained military-grade weaponry. Now, this operation wasn't relying on a month's worth of protest. Theoretically, they could have done this earlier, but they didn't. So events in April became the first crucial step towards the actual militarization of the conflict. But the dividing line between war and peace was only crossed about a week later, when the first clashes between Ukrainian security forces and armed men took place near Slavyansk. So I would like to briefly zoom into this second critical juncture of the sequence. Now, the key question in this context is whether the occupation of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk can be attributed to the Russian state, or whether it is more likely that the armed group that appeared in these 2 towns acted without the Kremlin's approval. So let's have a look at the evidence. First of all, there is an intercepted phone conversation in which the leader of the armed group that occupied the towns, Igor Girkin, up there on the left, reports back to Russian oligarch Konstantin Malafeyev, up there on the right. And in this conversation, Malafeyev and Girkin talk about briefing Sergei Aksyonov, who is the prime minister of Crimea. So we have an oligarch who is on good terms with the Kremlin, as well as the Kremlin-approved leader of annexed Crimea supervising this operation. And I would argue that in this situation, it doesn't really matter whether Putin actually gave an order. Either way, it is implausible that these people acted without at least the tacit approval of the Kremlin. Now, a second point is the fact that Girkin and several other members of this group have openly admitted that they had taken part in Russia's takeover of Crimea. And there is even a video showing Girkin in Simferopol on the 4th of March. Now, again, it is very unlikely that an armed group that supported Russian forces in Crimea could simply move on from there to the Donbas against the will of Russian state institutions. And there's a third point. Aksyonov is still in office. Malafeyev and Girkin live a quiet life in Moscow. So the Russian state hasn't done anything that indicates any disapproval of their actions. And these 3 points very strongly imply that the actions of Girkin's group can actually be linked to the Kremlin. But now, a second alternative hypothesis would be that Girkin's intervention played a less important role than local separatism, so that it was a supporting factor rather than the key cause of events. But it becomes very clear, both in the intercepted phone call and also in the general media coverage of events, that Girkin is actually in charge of the operation in Slavyansk. And yes, there are many local activists who join his ranks, but these people become subordinates of Girkin's men. And there were also some disagreements with locals. There's this famous video in which Girkin's men chase away local Afghan war veterans outside Kramatorsk police station even though these veterans are trying really hard to assure them that they are on the same side. And then we have Vyacheslav Ponomaryov, and he is the leader of a local self-defense force, and then becomes Slavyansk people's mayor for a few weeks. But then in early June, there's some sort of disagreement, and then Girkin simply has Ponomaryov arrested. And so all this basically shows that Girkin's group was in charge, and they were the driver of events. I mean, yes, they depended on local support, but the role of local factors was actually secondary to their intervention. So as far as the events in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk are concerned, this clearly was a Russian intervention with some local support, rather than a local uprising with some Russian support. So my task for the remainder of my PhD will be to analyze whether the same was the case for the other critical junctures that I identified. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.